When my daughter locked me out of her house using a lease she had forged with my own signature, she thought that was the final page. 6 months later, I stood on the courthouse steps holding the deed to that same 6-bedroom colonial, which I had just acquired at auction for $1 against the judgment she could not pay. Now I run it as a shared housing community for displaced older women, and every month I mail her an itemized invoice for the property taxes she still legally owes. And it all began because of a cheap wooden cigar box my husband left behind, a box she pitched into the trash without ever opening the secret compartment hidden inside. My name is Margaret. I am 54 years old, and I spent 32 years as the senior bookkeeper for Tallman's Lock and Hardware, a regional distributor that supplied everything from Mortise cylinders to commercial panic bars. That detail matters because 3 decades of reconciling 6-figure ledgers taught me to spot a penny that had wandered out of alignment, and unpacking shipment after shipment of padlocks and deadbolts taught me to open a basic pin tumbler lock with a tension wrench and a hook pick faster than most people can find their keys. I balanced the books, I managed the payroll, and I could disassemble a Schlage keypad lock and put it back together before my coffee got cold. My husband Frank was the quiet architect of our life, a civil engineer who drew straight lines and never raised his voice. He specialized in storm water retention systems, and he treated every drainage swale and culvert like a cathedral. We lived in a cream-colored colonial on Maple Drive in Cloverton, a house he had paid off 6 years early by calculating amortization schedules at the dinner table. Frank passed away on a Tuesday in March, a major myocardial infarction that took him before the ambulance lights had even stopped spinning in our driveway. I was still wearing his blue terry cloth bathrobe, the one that smelled like his aftershave, when my daughter Alina and her husband Mark walked through the front door 12 hours later, their faces arranged into expressions of concerned grief that looked like they had been rehearsed in the car. Alina was the golden child, the one whose baby book I filled out down to the minute of her first tooth. Straight A report cards, volleyball team captain, a degree in marketing that Frank and I paid for in full at St. Clair University. Mark was a financial advisor with a leased BMW 5 Series and a Tag Heuer watch that cost more than the down payment on our first home. They lived 42 minutes away in a gated subdivision called Pine Meadows, in a 6-bedroom brickfront colonial that was the second largest house on the cul-de-sac, a house they could not afford, though I did not know the full geometry of that debt yet. Within an hour of arriving, Alina had already started making suggestions. "You should not be alone in this big old house, Mom. The stairs are a death trap. We have a guest suite just sitting there." Mark nodded along, his eyes tracking across the living room like a real estate agent calculating square footage. They offered to help me sort through Frank's things. I was too stunned to refuse. Alina pulled open closet doors and dresser drawers with a kind of surgical efficiency, while Mark hauled plastic storage bins out to the garage. And then I saw her pick up Frank's old cigar box, a battered mahogany rectangle with a faded humidor label that he had kept on his nightstand since before we were married. It was not worth anything. The hinges were brass-plated and loose, and the finish had worn down to bare wood at the corners. She turned it over, shook it, and heard nothing rattle because Frank had lined the bottom with a layer of green felt that muffled any sound. "Trash," Alina said, and dropped it into a black garbage bag full of old ties and expired magazine subscriptions. I said nothing. I waited until they left for the evening to pick up takeout from the Italian place on Route 9, and then I fished that box out of the bag. The secret was in the lining. Frank had been building false bottoms into little wooden things since he was a boy, a hobby passed down from his grandfather, a cabite maker who had survived the Depression by making furniture that hid cash behind sliding panels. I pried up the felt with a butter knife, and underneath, set into a precisely routed recess, was a folded sheet of heavy drafting paper, the kind he used in his engineering notebooks. On it, in his careful block lettering, he had written one sentence: "Do not trust them. Save yourself." Beneath that, a date. The date was exactly 6 weeks before he died, the week after Alina had come to visit alone and had a closed-door conversation with him in the den. I had heard the murmur of voices through the wall, but had not thought much of it. Now, holding that slip of paper, I remembered that after she left, Frank had been quieter than usual, staring out the window at the drainage easement behind our yard. I sat on the edge of our bed, in the house we had shared for 34 years, and read that sentence 17 times. The vultures had already been circling, and my husband had seen their shadows before I did. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that no one, not even your own child, has the right to steal the roof from over your head. The manipulation began softly, the way a piling's infestation starts with a damp basement no one inspects. Alina came over the next morning with a cardboard cup holder containing 2 lattes and a sad smile, and she told me she could not bear the thought of me rattling around this empty house alone. She said Mark had crunched the numbers, spreadsheets, and everything, and they could pay off the rest of their mortgage if I sold my house and gave them the proceeds. In return, they would provide me with a place to live, meals, and care for the rest of my life. A lifetime care arrangement. She even wrote it down on a sheet of notebook paper, the kind with the 3-hole punch fringe, in blue ballpoint. Mom sells 134 Maple Drive. Net proceeds estimated at $340,000. Gifts the sum to Alina and Mark for debt elimination. And Alina and Mark provide room, board, and full elder care indefinitely. It was not a contract. It was a promise scrawled in a looped hand I remembered from the dozens of permission slips and field trip forms I had signed for her over the years. I looked at her face, the same face I had soothed through fevers and braces, and I saw only sincerity. But I also saw the block lettering of Frank's warning burned into my mind, so I smiled, nodded, and said, "Let me think about it." I played the part of the foggy, compliant widow, uncertain and slow, a woman whose grief made her easy to manage. Over the next week, she and Mark turned up the pressure like water in a hydrostatic test. They brought over mortgage statements printed from the lender's online portal, credit card bills with minimum payment amounts circled in red Sharpie, and a highlighted amortization schedule showing a balloon payment of $38,412 coming due on their adjustable rate mortgage in July. They said things like, "We hate to ask, but we are drowning, and you would be helping your family, and we want you close to us forever." I asked one question only, in a small, hesitant voice, my eyes not quite meeting theirs, and I would never have to worry about a place to live. "Never," Alina said, her hand covering mine on the kitchen table. "You will have a home with us until your last day." I saved the text messages from that exact conversation, every single one. On my old Samsung Galaxy, I created a folder labeled insurance and moved every text into it, including the ones where Mark sent photos of the balloon payment notice and the ones where Alina wrote, "I promise, Mom, this is forever." I backed that folder up to 3 different cloud services that night. I sold the house. I called a realtor named Diane who had sold 2 other homes on our block, and I told her I needed a clean, fast sale. She priced it at $349,900, but I accepted a cash offer of $345,000 because the buyer was a retired couple with no contingencies and a 20-day close. The closing took 23 days from listing to settlement, in a title company office on the 3rd floor of a glass building near the county courthouse. I netted $341,602 after commissions and transfer taxes. I sat at that conference table with a notary and a stack of documents, and I signed away the house where I had raised my daughter. The house where Frank had read engineering manuals in his recliner and planted a rose garden along the back fence for our 35th anniversary. Then I walked to the bank next door and obtained a cashier's check payable to Gateway Mortgage Services for $290,000 exactly, covering the principal balance and accrued interest on Alina's loan. I wrote a second cashier's check for the remaining $51,602, split among 3 credit card issuers: Bluestone Visa, Titanium MasterCard, and the Discover card that had a promotional balance transfer about to expire. I kept $600 in my personal checking account and nothing else. I moved into their guest room the following Saturday, carrying 2 suitcases and a banker's box of photo albums and tax returns. The guest room was a sunlit space with a walk-in closet and an en-suite bathroom that still smelled like the lavender sachets Alina had placed there for staging. For the first few months, everything seemed peaceful. I cooked dinner most nights, a rotation of pot roast, lemon chicken, and the meatloaf recipe my own mother had used. I tended their garden, weeding the hosta beds and remulching the front walkway with the pine bark chips Mark bought at the big box home center. I organized their paperwork because old bookkeeping habits die hard, filing their utility bills, insurance statements, and property tax receipts into a hanging folder system I set up in the kitchen desk. And I noticed things. I noticed everything because my brain had been trained for 32 years to read a general ledger and see immediately which accounts did not reconcile. The first red flag was the phone calls. Mark would retreat into his home office, a carpeted room at the end of the hallway with a hollow core door that did not block sound as well as he thought. I would hear his voice rising, then dropping into a frantic whisper. I heard phrases like cash flow gap, bridge loan, and I can make payroll next week if the RIFI goes through. I knew financial terminology the way a mechanic knows the sound of a failing alternator. A cash flow gap meant their income was not covering their operating expenses. A bridge loan meant they were borrowing short-term money at punishing interest rates to cover that gap. A RIFI meant they were trying to pull equity out of a house that I now strongly suspected had already been drained. I also noticed that Alina had stopped mentioning any idea of long-term care. She never took me to a doctor's appointment. She never asked about my blood pressure, which had been borderline for 15 years. When I mentioned that I was thinking of getting a small part-time job at the library just for pocket money, Mark's response was sharp and immediate. Absolutely not. We can handle everything, just focus on relaxing. But what he meant was, don't earn your own money. Don't build your own safety net. Don't create a single document that shows independence. Then came the day I was repairing a sticky drawer in the kitchen, the bottom right drawer where they kept the pot lids. The drawer had been jamming for weeks, the wooden runner swollen with humidity from the dishwasher vent below. I found a utility knife in the garage junk drawer, a disposable model with a retractable blade, and a sheet of fine grit sandpaper left over from a furniture project. I pulled the drawer completely out, laid it on the counter, and carefully shaved down the swollen edge with the knife, then sanded it smooth in long, even strokes. Alina walked in while I was wiping the dust away with a damp paper towel. "How do you know how to do that?" she asked, a crease between her eyebrows. "I spent 30 years married to an engineer who taught me to fix things instead of replacing them," I said, "and I also spent those years around locksmiths who could rebuild a Mortise lock from a shoebox full of springs." Later that same day, I overheard her on the phone with her friend Nicole, standing in the sunroom with her back to the door. "She's actually useful," she said, which is more than I expected. That word, useful, settled in the pit of my stomach like a cold stone. I was not a mother. I was not a guest. I was an asset that needed to prove its return. The shredder was the key. Mark owned a high-capacity cross-cut shredder, a black fellow's power shred that could take 15 sheets at a time and chewed paper into confetti squares. He kept it in the corner of his office, and once a week I emptied the bin into a black garbage bag, part of the cleaning routine I had adopted to keep my hands busy. But one Wednesday afternoon, while Alina was at a spin class and Mark was at his office, the bin was overflowing, and a single strip of paper had escaped the blades and lay caught in the slot. I pulled it free. It showed part of a header in bold type, residential lease agreement, and then, in a smaller font, the beginning of a tenant name field. Mar. There was only one Margaret in that house. My breath stopped, and I sat down cross-legged on the beige office carpet, my heart pounding like a riveting hammer. I carefully tipped the entire bin onto the floor and began to sift through the confetti, piece by piece, using the desk lamp as a spotlight. I had reconciled 60,000 bank records at Tallman's without a single error, and I approached that pile of shredded paper with the same methodical patience. I sorted, aligned torn edges, matched font fragments. I reconstructed the skeleton of a lease term, 12 months, a rental amount, $1 monthly, a clause about eviction for non-payment, and a signature block where a photocopied approximation of my own handwriting had been pasted in, clearly lifted from a document I had signed earlier that year, a permission form for a landscaping project. They were building a case. They had already drafted a fraudulent lease that would classify me as a tenant paying a token amount, which would allow them to evict me as a non-paying renter. Once I was gone, every dollar I had given them would disappear into the murk of their finances, and I would be a 60-something woman with no savings, no home, and a piece of forged paper telling the sheriff I was a deadbeat. I had been set up to be the scapegoat for their debt, the final item on their balance sheet that could be written off. I spent the next 2 days photocopying every financial document I could find that had been left even slightly unsecured. Mark kept a locking filing cabinet in his office, a cheap Honeywell 4-drawer vertical unit with a tubular cam lock, the kind that secures with a hollow cylindrical key. I had sold thousands of those exact locks over the years at Tallman's, and I knew the bypass method by heart because we had trained customers to avoid them specifically for this reason. I took a Bic ballpoint pen from the kitchen drawer, removed the ink cartridge, and trimmed the end of the plastic barrel with my utility knife until it had a slightly tapered edge. I inserted it into the tubular keyway, felt the pins align against the soft plastic, applied gentle rotational pressure, and the lock turned with a click in 11 seconds. Inside, I found the original signed documents that showed they had taken out a predatory home equity line of credit against the house at 18% interest from a lender called Summit Equity Partners, a company that specialized in borrowers with poor credit and no other options. The loan had already been sold to a third-party debt collector named Mid-Atlantic Portfolio Recovery. I found a separate folder labeled Estate Planning, which contained a draft durable power of attorney and a draft last will and testament, both naming Mark as agent and executor, and both bearing a signature that looked like mine, but was fractionally off in the loop of the capital M, the same forged signature from the lease. I found printed copies of my own bank statements, showing the checking account that now held $600 and nothing else, and I found the finished version of the forged lease, printed on heavy 24-pound linen finish paper, notarized with a stamp that bore the name K. Dorsey, Notary Public, and a commission number that I later learned had been purchased online from a vendor that did not verify credentials. I photographed every document with my phone, front and back, and uploaded the images to a password-protected cloud account that used two-factor authentication tied to my email, not to any device Mark or Alina could access. I knew then that I was not just a guest. I was prey, chemically tranquilized, and being fattened for a legal slaughter. And I also knew that Frank's warning had not been paranoia. He had seen the exact pattern of greed, the cold calculus of waiting for a death, and then draining the survivor, a pattern he had probably recognized the day Alina sat in his den and asked him for money one final time. So I began to fight back in the only way I knew how, with perfect documentation, procedural rigor, and the patience of a woman who had reconciled 60,000 line-item bank statements without a single error. I started recording every interaction. I live in a single-party consent state, meaning that under state statute, I could legally record any conversation I was a part of without informing the other party. I purchased a small Olympus digital voice recorder with a 40-hour battery life and a tie clip microphone, and I wore it clipped inside my shirt collar every waking moment. I documented dates, times, and verbatim exchanges. I saved every text message, including the ones where Alina explicitly wrote, "We will take care of you forever if you help us pay off the house," and the ones where Mark asked, "Can you bring the bank statement showing the sale deposit so we can reconcile it for tax season?" I printed hard copies of the text transcripts and kept them in a manila envelope taped to the underside of the guest room dresser. Then, once my evidence binder was thick enough to stop a knife, I called an attorney. Her name was Karen Okonkwo, and she specialized in elder financial exploitation, a subspecialty of estate litigation that she had built over 12 years. She had been recommended by a compliance officer at Gateway Mortgage, a woman named Sandra who had handled the payoff of Alina's loan and had privately pulled me aside after the closing to say she had seen this situation too many times. Karen met me at a coffee shop 2 towns over, a place called Brood Awakening, that had no connection to anyone in my family's orbit. I laid out everything on the table between a ceramic mug and a sugar shaker. The house sale documents, the oral agreement written in ballpoint, the text message screenshots, the shredded lease fragments carefully taped onto sheets of printer paper, the photographs of the forged signature block, the notary stamp, and the confirmation from the online vendor that it was fraudulent, the audio files of the conversations where Alina promised lifetime care, and the recording I had not yet made but planned to make. Karen was silent for a long moment, turning the pages of my meticulously organized 3-ring binder, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. Then she looked up and said, "Margaret, this is one of the cleanest cases of constructive fraud and elder exploitation I have ever assembled. The dollar amounts are clear, the evidence chain is continuous, and the intent is documented. But there is one thing we still lack, a real-time demonstration that they are willing to harm you physically or abandon you in a crisis to complete their scheme. We need a moment that proves they have no remaining humanity, a moment that will gut any defense that they were just confused about the agreement. Have you ever considered setting a trap? We planned it over 2 more meetings. I continued to wear my recorder, and I began to seed small, careful comments about my health. I mentioned dizzy spells when I stood up too fast. I left my blood pressure cuff on the bathroom counter, the reading deliberately set to a slightly elevated number. I asked Alina at dinner if she remembered what symptoms her grandmother had before her stroke, because I had been feeling a little pressure in my temples. She waved it off, but I saw Mark's eyes flicker with a cold calculation. They needed me cooperative and conscious long enough to sign something. If I died too soon, the forged documents might be challenged. A medical crisis where I was incapacitated, but alive would give them a window to act. The maximum cruelty beat came on a Thursday night. I had been slicing carrots at the kitchen island for a pot roast, the same dish I had made a dozen times before, and I set the stage carefully. I had loosened the lid on a jar of olive oil so it would roll when I bumped it. I had rehearsed the fall, a controlled collapse that would land me on the ceramic tile without injury, but with enough noise to bring them from the living room. At 7:35, I bumped the oil jar, let it clatter, and then went down. I let my body go slack, my eyes closed, my breathing shallow and irregular, my face deliberately slack. I lay half on the gray tile and half on the braided rug, one arm outstretched, my pulse thudding in my ears. I heard Mark's footsteps first, quick and sharp, then Alina's softer tread. "Is she breathing?" Alina asked, her voice high and tight. Mark knelt for exactly 2 seconds, enough to check that I was not dead and not faking obviously, and then I heard his voice go flat. "She's breathing." Then I heard the sound of papers rustling on the kitchen counter above me. "Wait," Mark said. "Where's the lease? We need to get her to sign it before she goes to a hospital. If they put her on a hold and she's incapacitated, we lose access for weeks." Alina said, "She's on the floor, Mark." "I know," he said, and I heard his loafer step directly over my outstretched hand, the sole brushing against my fingers. "The lease is on the printer. Grab the final version and a pen." I kept my breathing steady, my eyes sealed, and I counted to 60 after they left the room. Then I stood up, walked to my guest room, locked the door with the deadbolt I had quietly installed the previous weekend using a kit from the hardware store, and transferred the audio file from my recorder to my secure cloud storage. That recording was time-stamped 7:41 p.m. I never felt another moment of guilt after that. The last flicker of maternal hope extinguished itself like a candle in a sealed jar. 2 days later, they moved to execute their plan. I had offered to go to the grocery store, a chore Alina had suddenly encouraged with a detailed list, and a fresh Edge gift card she had received from her real estate agent. I played along, took my purse and my reusable shopping bags, and drove my 10-year-old Toyota to the store. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, then returned. The key would not turn in the front door. The locks had been changed, the same Schlage deadbolts I could have bypassed in under a minute, replaced with some other brand I did not bother to identify. A piece of paper was taped to the storm door, a printed copy of the forged lease with my forged signature on the last page, along with a typed notice of eviction for non-payment of rent, effective immediately. My small roller suitcase and a cardboard box of my clothes had been placed on the front porch next to a dead potted fern. Alina and Mark stood inside the foyer, visible through the glass, their arms folded in a synchronized posture of righteous authority. Alina's voice came through the door, muffled but clear. "You're a tenant now, Mom. You didn't pay your rent, so you have to leave. That's how the law works." Mark added, "We'll send the rest of your things. Don't make a scene." I made a scene, not with screaming or pounding on the door, but with calm, procedural precision. I walked to the edge of the lawn, just past the property line on the public sidewalk, and I called Karen Okonkwo's direct line. She picked up on the second ring and said only, "Is it time?" "It is," I said, and I gave her the address. She was there in 22 minutes, pulling up in a dark sedan, and a sheriff's deputy she had already briefed arrived 12 minutes after that. A 40-something man named Deputy Castellano, who carried a clipboard and a body-worn camera. I had printed copies of everything in a folder I kept in my trunk for exactly this moment. The text message thread showing the lifetime care promise, the forged lease, the notary verification of fraud, and the audio recording of Mark stepping over my apparently dying body to grab a signature. Deputy Castellano reviewed the documents on the hood of his cruiser, plugged the audio file into a small speaker he carried in his duty bag, and listened to the exchange. Then he walked up to the front door and knocked with the heavy certainty of a man who had seen this exact scenario too many times. He explained the state statutes regarding elder financial exploitation, forgery, and illegal constructive eviction. Alina's face went the color of skim milk. Mark began to bluster about his rights as a property owner and threatened to call his own attorney, but the deputy cut him off with a flat, rehearsed line. You have 30 minutes to vacate the premises until a civil hearing can determine temporary possession, or you will be arrested on the spot for grand theft by deception and criminal forgery. 33 minutes later, they drove away in the leased BMW, the trunk stuffed with garment bags and a desktop computer tower. I walked back into the house that was still technically theirs, but only because the legal machinery had not yet finished its work. That was the beginning of the legal war, not the end. Over the next months, I worked with Karen to file a civil suit for financial elder exploitation, seeking restitution of the full amount I had given them plus treble damages under the state's elder protection statute, totaling $410,000. We served subpoenas for bank records, mortgage documents, and the fraudulent notary seal. The online notary vendor folded in 48 hours and provided time-stamped IP logs showing Mark had purchased the seal under a fake name using a credit card I had not paid off. Summit Equity Partners, the predatory HELOC lender, provided documentation of Alina and Mark's signatures on the balloon payment terms and records of the 18% interest rate that had been accruing since the day they signed. And then, the breakthrough, the text messages I had saved. In discovery, we produced a continuous message thread from 3 separate dates, where Alina explicitly acknowledged that I had given her $341,000 in exchange for a promise of lifetime housing and care. Under the statute of frauds, a promise to transfer real property or provide long-term care in exchange for money is normally required to be in writing, but the exception for partial performance was airtight. I had fully performed my end of the bargain by selling my home and paying off their debts, and they had accepted that benefit. The oral contract was enforceable, and the texts constituted a written acknowledgement of the terms. The judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Van, granted summary judgment in our favor after a 30-minute hearing. $410,000, plus my legal fees of $32,000, plus a permanent protective injunction forbidding any further contact. Alina and Mark declared they could not pay. They had already drained every line of credit. The house was underwater by $60,000, and their only remaining assets were the leased car and a joint checking account with $400. The judgment became a lien against the Pine Meadows property, and Karen moved to foreclose under the state's judgment lien enforcement statute. The auction was held on a cold Thursday morning in late February, on the marble steps of the county courthouse, with a flag flapping overhead and a small crowd of investors who had no idea what they were bidding on. Karen had structured the credit bid so that my judgment would serve as the purchase money, a legal maneuver that allowed me to bid the amount owed without needing to produce cash. I stood next to her in my best wool coat, a black one Frank had bought me for a Christmas 10 years ago, and when the auctioneer called for bids, I raised my hand and offered $1 against the credit bid. The credit covered the full judgment amount, extinguishing the lien, and the $1 was the minimum statutory credit required to transfer title. There were no other bidders. The auctioneer brought down his gavel, and the deed was recorded in my name 48 hours later, free and clear of any mortgage or encumbrance. I did not sell the house. I had no need for 6 bedrooms, but I knew there were other women like me, displaced older women who had been betrayed by the very people they had raised and sacrificed for. Women whose children had drained their savings, forged their names, and locked them out. I contacted a nonprofit called Second Season Housing, an organization that helped older adults find affordable shared living arrangements, and I worked with their compliance team to convert the Pine Meadows property into a licensed shared housing community. We installed grab bars in the bathrooms, a ramp over the front steps, and a fire sprinkler system. Within 4 months, I had 5 residents, all women over 60, each paying a modest monthly rent based on their fixed incomes. I lived there too, in the same guest room I once occupied. But now I am the owner, the manager, and the maintenance person, fixing sticky drawers with the same skills I learned at Tallman's. The house has a small brass nameplate next to the front door now, Frank's house, after the man whose quiet warning saved my life. As for Alina and Mark, they moved into a studio apartment off the interstate in the next county, a unit with a hot plate and a Murphy bed that folds down over the living space. He sells sedans at a dealership called Taggart Auto, and she stocks shelves overnight at a warehouse club. Their wages are garnished for the deficiency balance, and more importantly, for the ongoing property tax liability that followed the title transfer. Because here is a detail most people do not realize. When property transfers at a forced judicial sale, the previous owners remain personally liable for any property taxes that were assessed and unpaid during their period of ownership, and those debts do not discharge in bankruptcy. The county assessor confirmed that the final quarter of taxes, plus a penalty for underpayment, had been left unpaid by Alina and Mark before the auction. I registered that obligation as a personal debt owed by the former title holders, and the county now sends me a quarterly statement showing the accrued interest at the statutory rate of 18% per annum, compounded monthly. Every month, I print a copy of that statement, slide it into a window envelope along with a politely worded invoice on Frank's house letterhead, and mail it to their apartment. I include a self-addressed stamped envelope for their convenience. I have been doing this for 8 months now. The balance owed is $1,247.53, and I have collected exactly $0 in payments. But the interest continues to compound, and I will continue mailing those invoices until the full amount is satisfied or the 20-year statute of limitations tolls its last day. I think about Frank often. I think about the patience it takes to build a secret compartment in a cigar box, to line it with felt so it passes a casual shake test, to write a warning on heavy drafting paper in engineering block letters, to carry that quiet knowledge for 6 weeks before a heart attack takes you, trusting that your wife will find it and act. He knew our daughter better than I did, or at least he accepted a truth I was too loyal to see. Loyalty to family is a virtue, but it can also be a blindfold, and the people who love you most are not always the people who protect you. Sometimes the real love is a dead man's note tucked behind felt, waiting to be found. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Tell me your story in the comments below. If you believe that no one should get away with stealing a mother's future, hit like and subscribe. It helps more women find these stories. I will see you in the next one.